Can you make millions selling fake booze? For the last couple of weeks, I have been seeing so many celebrities launch their own non alcoholic beverage, from Blake Lively, Katy Perry, and Tom Holland. Zendaya's future husband has launched a non alcoholic beverage, and his was launched to a lot of fanfare. His brand is called Barrow. Get it? Beer with zero alcohol, and it was in all of the trade magazines, and he did a very big press tour for it. And it made me wonder, isn't there a ton of fake beer out there? Like, why is this so special? Are there still millions to be made in this space? What do these celebrities know that I don't know? So I did a little investigation, and I'm excited to share with you. We're going to talk about the market today. So what is the size of the market? And I got a lot of great feedback from the last video. So we're going to go into some numbers of how to start the business. What is the sort of revenue and profitability of the business? Then we're going to take a look at some alternatives and overall what my take is about whether or not a non-alcoholic beverage brand is a good business to start now in 2025. But first, let's look at some cultural tailwinds of why we're here. In the 90s, when people were drinking non alcoholic beer like an O'Doul's, it was really positioned as a product for someone who had an issue with drinking alcohol, i.e., they were someone who was on their sobriety journey, and that this was a beverage that they could take while being at the bar and not feel tempted, even though actually doing a non alcoholic beverage that looks and feels just like that beverage is not encouraged at all by a lot of the addiction groups. That being said, now sobriety is a totally different ballgame. Talking about your sobriety doesn't have the same taboo it had 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, talking about your sobriety is probably a wellness badge of honor, because there are so many reasons why people are choosing to be sober that has nothing to do with addiction issues. Being sober curious because you want to work on your body, because you don't want to gain weight, because you want more mental clarity, or simply you just want to test yourself, similarly to what people do in dry January, where you just want to see if you can do it, is on the uptick. So many people are detoxing. People are detoxing from their phones. They're doing a sweat detox, a sugar detox. There's even a detox from trends, which is literally my job, where they're telling us, like, don't follow the trends because you're becoming addicted to knowing what's next and what's new. So detoxing and participating in a detox is, unfortunately, the trend. And it's actually become part of our culture. I actually don't think it's a trend anymore. I think it's pretty common for someone just to say that they are detoxing. I also think there is a rise of a lot of alternatives that, quite frankly, don't give you the same hangover effect and don't lead to the same sort of disastrous effects of being blackout drunk. And what I'm talking about is the rise of legal cannabis that's happened in the last 5 and 6 years, where it's caused the term to be called, what is it, California sober, to indicate that you do everything but alcohol, that you're still fun, but you just don't drink alcohol. So between cannabis, hemp, I think during the pandemic, a lot of people were doing psychedelics, were exploring adaptogens, playing around with mushrooms, or taking a Delta 9 gummy. There's so many more alternatives to just alcohol. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to look at non-alcoholic beverages that mimic alcoholic beverages. Does that make sense? So we're going to talk about non-alcoholic tequila, non-alcoholic beer, wine, spritzers. We are not talking about soda or kombucha or something that simply just doesn't have alcohol in it anyway. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sober, curious people are participating in things like dry January. We actually saw the most uptick in people saying that they were going to give up drinking in January of 2025 than any year prior. And this is specifically driven by Gen Z. Gen Z is drinking over 20% less than millennials. And they're actually the biggest cohort that's moving to buying these non alcoholic beverages. I also, before I forget, removed cannabis beverages from this conversation. While there's a lot of money to be made, and I know a lot of cannabis and hemp beverages that are doing 60 to 70 million in revenue, those businesses have so much regulation that I wanted to remove that from the equation. If you want me to do a video, just let me know. But for this conversation, it's non-alcoholic beverages that you could buy at a typical store without really any legal restrictions. So legal non-alcoholic beverages is what we're talking about today. Now, beyond the cultural tailwinds that I'm seeing with Gen Z, I wanted to see what people are searching on Google and what are they talking about in Reddit communities, because that's how I sort of investigate whether or not a trend has staying power. And for the last 5 years, the searches for how to be sober are on the rise. People are looking up influencers who are sober, they are looking up mocktail recipes, and really trying to figure out how to participate in this lifestyle. We are seeing the rise of sober bars across the country, where there are sober bars in New York and San Francisco. In Atlanta, where I'm currently at, there are specific nights and activities that are marketed as being for the sober curious, in which there will be a non-alcoholic mocktail as part of the experience, but there won't be any alcoholic beverages. I was at a wine, not a wine, I was at a wedding recently, and it was a sober wedding. However, they had a cart of non alcoholic beverages, which is also something that we are starting to see more and more of. Okay, so why does this even matter? Who am I? Well, I'm Kim Dillon. I love trends, I love culture, and I love startups. And so at that intersectionality is where I play. I take businesses from zero to hero, whether they are startups or large CPG companies. And I've been doing this for over a decade. And so, with that being said, let's dive into the numbers because this market is huge. Now, this industry is worth $11 billion. 11 billion with a B. It's expected to grow to $30 billion by 2030. Now, even though those are big numbers, that's just 1% of the non of the alcoholic industry space. So $11 billion is just 1% of all the alcoholic sales. That being said, alcoholic companies like a Heineken or Budweiser or Diageo are making acquisitions in the space if they themselves are not launching alcoholic versions of their favorite products in their portfolio. But what's typical in this space, and by space I mean beverages in general, is to acquire. Typically, beverage companies launch new flavors of existing brands, new sizes, new formats, but they tend to acquire new brands when there's a new ingredient trend or a new cultural trend. So this is a space that is just primed for acquisition. In fact, non-alcoholic related, but just to show the point of acquisitions, Poppy, which was a probiotic soda, which I believe launched on Shark Tank just a couple years ago, recently was acquired for $2 billion. Now, you would think that Pepsi could just launch their own probiotic soda, but for a lot of these larger companies, it's actually easier for them to acquire than it is for them to build that brand themselves. Now, when I think about this business, I think there's actually two businesses or two places to play. One is in launching a brand. So emerging brands would be like a Kin or a Gia or something like a Bon Buzz or one of my favorites, Little Saints. Or it's launching an experience or a retail solution. So being a retailer of non-alcoholic beverages or hosting an experience like having a sober bar or having a sober bar cart at a wedding. So there's the brand opportunity, but then there's also the experience opportunity. Now, I heard you from the last video, so I did get some numbers so we can actually know what are the startup costs for a typical brand and what are some of the revenue numbers one could expect if they were launching in this space. Now, a lot of these brands surprisingly have gone on Shark Tank. Shark Tank must be the conduit for beverages because so many of the brands that are the top brands in this category have just, and I mean by just, I mean in the last 24 months, all been on Shark Tank or Dragon's Den, which is Canada's version of the same thing. And so from that research, what I gathered is that on the lowest, and I mean like day one cost, between 50,000 and 250,000. But what was common across all of these brands was that they really had at least $1 million to do anything significant. So 50 to 250,000 was a lot of the R&D costs, getting the initial run, sending that out to influencers and doing pop-ups. But if they wanted to be retail ready or they were trying to sell online, a lot of them had $1 million of starting capital. Now, one of the top brands that I researched was called Gia, Ghia, hopefully I'm saying that correctly, and all of their numbers were available on a Shark Tank blog. And one of the things that was really interesting was that this is a brand that retails for $38 for their aperitif size, $38, and she stated that it cost $6.50 to produce. And this was for her initial run. So she was suggesting or implying that cost would be even less than that, which puts it at an 80% profit margin for her ready to drink. So think like the single serve aluminum cans. She was retailing them for $5 and it cost her about $1.25 to make. So that would be an 80% margin, which is huge. And these were her starting margins, which makes me think that there's even better margins that could be achieved with economy of scale. Now, one of the things that was interesting for her and for a number of the other brands was that most of their sales came through e-com, which meant that these revenue numbers and cost numbers were for selling through their own website and not necessarily reflective of what it'd be like if they had gotten an alcoholic distributor or were sold at alcoholic stores, like a liquor store, which I actually think means that there's a huge opportunity. If you can make 8 figures through your own website to get started before you hit retail, you can really start to understand your customer and what you want to offer. Because in beverages, it's about, especially beverages in retail, it is often about what we call owning the shelf, which means you have to have multiple sizes, multiple flavors, and that is a real hard cost to launch with, i.e., usually most of these brands launch with 1 or 2 flavors in one size. And then quickly, 6 to 18 months out, they'll launch ready to drink. If they launch with a bottle, they launch ready to drink. If they launch ready to drink, they launch with a bottle. So you start with one size option over the other. And then after you've gotten some traction, that's when the flavors come. And sometimes you don't even really care. This is an insider thing that I've learned from working at some of the larger CPG companies. Sometimes they don't even care if these flavors are exciting, productive, sell through. They just don't want any other brand to have that shelf space, which is why you'll see a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi come up with these weird flavors. And they're coming up with flavors because they just want that shelf space. Because if you can have the block of shelf space, that means your competitor cannot. And it also means that someone's more likely to reach and grab your product than someone else's. Now, the second opportunity is really in experiences. And I actually think this is huge. I think the cost and the barrier of entry here is so much different because it really depends on how you scale this out. So if you want to specialize in sober weddings, I think there's an opportunity in building and bringing a lot of unique brands and mocktails to that experience. If you want to open a sober bar or partner with a bar, and then you are bringing the beverages that make it really exciting. There's retail locations that are franchising. One is called Zero Proof. And Zero Proof is like a trendy bodega that only sells super bougie snacks and non alcoholic beverages. It looks just like a liquor store. Well, actually, it looks like a much nicer liquor store. It looks more like a wine store. And they have a huge selection. One that I looked at, specifically Zero Proof, had over 55 brands, and they have a couple of locations across the country. So either opening your own retail location or doing a franchise of sort. I think especially if you live in a geography that's not that exposed to something like this, could be a really huge opportunity. Now, that being said, those costs are all up to you. There's really no specific number. I imagine that you could probably start somewhere between $10,000 all the way up to $25,000 or $50,000, depending on what you are bringing to a catering situation. If you're doing retail usually is between 100,000 to $500,000 all in as it relates to securing a space and inventory, et cetera. It's really a lot of variables at play when it comes to that specific market segment. But I think I would mirror it off of a retail store and use those types of numbers because there's a lot of things that are pretty similar. The only thing that I'm not sure is what types of regulations you would have. You would not need a liquor license per se, but I've noticed when you're entering something that's adjacent to something that's a vice, people get a little testy. So a sheriff's department or whoever usually is in charge of a liquor license might need to be educated on exactly what you are doing. But even the education you probably could monetize, especially if a community wanted to get sober together and want to explore how to be sober. I think that there's a lot of opportunities there. So that's on the experience side. We talked about the brand side a little bit. Now, here are some of the challenges that I think you're going to face. I think the regulations are going to be murky, whether or not you're launching a brand or you're launching an experience. Being very clear about what you're doing is going to be an issue. I also think if you're launching a beverage, being very clear that it's not alcoholic is going to be important, but I imagine that you still cannot appeal to children or anyone who's under the age. I imagine you do not want a 12-year-old to be drinking your non alcoholic beverage, even if there's nothing bad in that product. You can't really claim things. So while a lot of these beverages do say they give you a little razzle dazzle, they give you a little sensation, especially the ones that include mushrooms, the legal variety, are adaptogens, are hemp. State by state, those things are regulated. So you have to be really careful of how you claim what your product is. You can't really say that something is relaxing because you can't say anything that's a function of something that is changing someone's state. You really can't even say that something is causing you to be sleepy, but you can say something promotes better sleep. It promotes a better mood. It's a good time, vibes, but you can't say relaxing. Even chill, I have found can get you in trouble. So you can't make a function, it's called a function structure claim, but you can talk about a mood or a sensation, but nothing that's like a function of your body or an emotion. So I think there's some regulations that you're going to have to work through. I think consumer skepticism. Now, I've made the whole case that like Gen Z is not drinking. A lot of people are actually not drinking. However, I still think a lot of people kind of meet this like, is this overpriced soda? Especially because a lot of brands are priced at parity with their alcoholic counterpart. So a non-alcoholic vodka is going to cost $60, the same price that the same type of vodka would be. Now, where the opportunities is restaurants. So restaurants, there was a study that was recently done that if they sell or offer rather a non-alcoholic beverage, they actually get receipts that are 20 or 30% higher. And that's because instead of offering soda, offering a mocktail provides, you with more margin and more actual dollars in. So it's a real interesting opportunity to partner with restaurants because it does drive revenue and profit margin. So those were some of the concerns. My last concern is that it's just a very competitive space. I opened this video with saying so many celebrities are jumping in and there are so many emerging brands that would cause me to have a lot of concerns. But I do want to do a deep dive so that we can go further into some of the numbers. And this is a brand where I actually know the founder, and I perhaps should invite her and do a one off video. That could be really fun. And so this brand is Little Saints. I actually met her maybe during the pandemic, a little bit after the pandemic, shooting a video for Cheech and Chong, which is a story for another time. And she had just launched this brand in these cute mint ready to drink beverages. And I think some of the flavors was an espresso martini and another one was a Paloma cocktail. And I can't remember what the other two were. I think one might have been a play on a gin and tonic, and maybe another one might have been a margarita play. And her unique ingredient story is mushrooms, the legal kind. So lion's mane, reishi, chaga, and adaptogens. And some of these beverages actually can give you a little bit of a buzz, a little tingle, as it were. And so she was really at the right time in which people were exploring cannabis, people were exploring psychedelics, like I mentioned. And so most of us haven't heard of a mushroom based drink. And a lot of people are probably going to lean in and think there's something magical about it, even though there's not. Anyway, she was on Shark Tank last year, so we have some numbers to dive in. Before we go into the numbers, actually, though, I do want to share how I thought she was marketing her brand to give some context to some of these numbers. Now, she launched pretty early on at Erewhon. If you're not familiar with Erewhon, Erewhon is the super bougie grocery store in California. I think when I first moved to LA just a few years ago, there was like two locations. And since the pandemic, it's exploded, and now there are 25 locations. And I think they are looking to expand out of the state. If you are in New York, I think what would be comparable would be Happier Grocer. And if you're in Austin or Chicago, it might be similar to a Foxtrot. But they usually are better for you type snacks and a very expensive salad bar. It's also the home of the Hailey Bieber smoothie, which is $24, which I'm going to go ahead and say is one of the most amazing smoothies you can imagine. But the reason why I mention this is that this is where you want to launch if you're in this category. Anything CPG related, so anything that's a food, a snack, something where you want an influencer to take a photo, Erewhon is that store. And that is really how you can get a lot of traction. A lot of buyers from other types of stores and categories actually follow Erewhon's lead. So if Erewhon it does well, that kind of indicates that it could do well for other markets and other channels. So when she was on Shark Tank, she mentioned that she had raised $1 million of her own capital. Not raised, she used $1 million of her own capital, but then she quickly raised another 2.2 million within that first year. She made about half a million in her first year, which I think is amazing. But since then has grown her revenues in 2024 to $4 million. She's looking at a forecast for 2025 between $9 and $11 million, which is pretty amazing for a brand that was started 3 years ago by one person. She also shared some of her marketing costs. So overall, she shared that her CAC was $42. And CAC, for those who don't know, is customer acquisition cost. It is basically the average of all of the marketing activities that you're doing. It is how much do I spend to get a customer? So she spends $42 to get a customer through the door to buy a product. She also shared what her lifetime value was, which we refer to in the industry as LTV, which has a 4x ratio, which basically means that if she spends $42 to get a customer, she can expect that they are going to spend $200 with her over the life of that customer. which is a very, very strong ratio. Usually in this category, we see somewhere between 1.5 and 2. So this either means that people are spending a lot of money with her one time, or they're coming back and ordering again and again. And either way, those are really great numbers. Like I said, she got very early distribution with Erewhon, which led to distribution at Sprouts, which is an independent grocer. One of the things she did share was that 75% of her revenues come from her website. And talking to a number of brand founders in this space years ago, I think that that's pretty consistent. The brand Gia also said that their number one distribution channel was e-com. And both of these brands really want to penetrate the restaurant space, probably because restaurants can really increase their margins if they offer these mocktail experiences. And if something has a strong brand behind it, I imagine that that is even more appealing to a restaurant. I think that there's other channels that these drinks and beverages haven't really entered, including hospitality, sporting events, hotels, travel. There's so much opportunity here versus just selling on your own website. So if we're seeing a lot of brands making 8 figures on their own, that tells me that there's a huge opportunity for people who can really nail distribution. Okay, so let's say that you are interested in moving forward with starting this beverage brand. Let's break down some of those costs. Well, if you're going to work with a co-packer, which I would recommend, you're going to spend between $50 and $100,000 doing that first run. That includes everything from R&D of figuring out what your recipe is, from sourcing the ingredients, designing that first label, figuring out what is the bottle or the ready to drink can that you are going to be leveraging, and making that first pallet run. So usually you have to order a pallet that, if we imagine a 1 liter bottle, that's probably 10,000 units. Now, if you order less than that, you can definitely cut costs, but you're going to be paying more per bottle. However, the suggested run is 10,000 units. What you can do is make something in your kitchen sink and figure out sort of what your formula is. However, you still have to pay a scale up cost. I have done this in the past with a number of clients, and even if you've nailed the recipe, it's really sourcing the ingredients at scale that becomes really tricky. So working with a co-packer, even if you have your own recipe, I think is the best way to get started. And so that's why you'll be paying some of those costs. Now you're also going to have to warehouse and do the supply chain of this. That's going to probably run you between $7,000 to $15,000, depending how many pallets is actually sitting in that warehouse. Then to be aware of how beverages are sold, right? They're sitting in a warehouse, but then they have to get sold to a distributor who takes a percentage, usually 10%. And then the distributor is going to sell it to a retailer. You probably have to pay a salesperson commission for making that sale. That's an ongoing cost. And then a lot of retailers are going to charge you a slotting fee. That's that shelf space that we talked about earlier. They're going to charge you for a slotting fee, and then they're also going to charge you for all of the marketing and promo they do at store. So if you launch into an end cap, or if you're on a flyer, or if you put it at the front of the store, or there's something special around your product in that store, you will be paying for that. You will also be paying for your own website and your marketing. I would imagine for marketing a new brand like this, if you're really focusing on DTC and you have to nail SEO and performance marketing, I would put that at $15,000 to $20,000 a month. So you're probably spending close to 200 grand a year. I think you're going to have some regulatory concerns, so maybe $15,000 there. The R&D is really up to you, between 5 and 50,000. So all in, probably 250 on the low side and close to 500 on the medium sides to get started. And then you're going to have a lot of working capital needs to really sustain the business. But those are the numbers. Same, but different. So I wanted to throw this idea out here that's not even in the non-alcoholic space, but is just in the beverage space. And the reason why I wanted to mention it was because I think the same cultural tailwinds that apply to the rise of non-alcoholic beverages are what's driving this category as well. And that is the category of dirty sodas. Now, from the name, you might think that dirty soda actually means soda with alcohol in it. No, this is really just fancy soda. I first ran across this trend, and I don't even think it's a trend yet. I think it's a baby trend, which makes it really interesting. And this is where the opportunities often lie. I saw it on the Real Housewives of Mormon Wives. And I noticed that a lot of these women were getting these 64-ounce sodas that they were calling dirty sodas. And they were drinking them at 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning because in the Mormon faith, you cannot consume hot beverages. And so, as a response to that, these women and teenagers are turning to dirty sodas. And that could be like a one off, but there was an actual store that was featured in the program that was called Swig. So when I was at home in the Midwest visiting my mom, to my surprise, there was a Swig location and there were so many cars just wrapped around this thing. And it's right next to, mind you, to Starbucks. And I really feel like they're stealing share from Starbucks because let's be real, most people who drink at Starbucks do not like coffee. You know, they're getting everything but actual coffee. They're getting the pink drink, they're getting a matcha latte, they're getting something else. Well, the new competitor in town is Swig, and Swig offers basically a $12 soda with fixins in it. Things like uh, cherries, pineapple, mango, milk, cream, cold espresso, ice cream, like whatever you can imagine that you would want in a soda, or not even want actually, they're putting in these dirty sodas. And I thought, okay, maybe this is just a Utah thing or a Midwest thing. This particular store has 150 locations. Their socials are blowing up. There is something happening here culturally around this wholesome, tradwife, conservative movement in which the soda store that harkens to the 1950s has an appeal. It's a third spot for a lot of teenagers and young people to hang out. It's not particularly expensive, and it doesn't really have a vice attached to it, even though I would argue how much sugar are these people drinking? However, it has the same kind of energy of non-alcoholic beverages. The same tailwinds are really driving it. So that's one to explore. And like I said, same, but different. Hopefully you liked this video in which we talked about whether or not you can make millions selling fake booze. The answer is a resounding yes, but you're going to need some starting capital, a lot of it, at least 250,000 to $500,000, if not a million. You're going to need a unique angle because this is a very crowded space. Crowded. When celebrities are dropping a non-alcoholic beverage brand every week, you have to do something to stand out, which means that you need to have premium branding or a cool experience, or there is an ingredient that you found in the Amazon that no one else has been exposed to. You also really need to nail your distribution. Now, if you have an in with restaurants, with hospitality, with the club channel, with a liquor store, that is where the opportunities are. Most of these brands are making their money on e-com, and whoever can break out of e-com and have DTC plus another channel is going to make millions. You can actually make billions if you can really figure out how to get two or more channels. Remember, this is beverages, and these big conglomerates acquire brands instead of innovate on their own. So the opportunity to strike it big is huge if you're willing to put in the legwork. If there's a business that you would like for me to explore or a trend you think I should know about, let me know and we'll find out if you can make millions doing it.